Welcome everybody to today's micro lecture on law and ethics. As you can see, today's micro lecture is structured in three main parts. The starting point will be the relationship of EU law and ethics. We will then look at the opinions of different philosophers, different philosophies. And the third main part will be the three key normative theories, which are deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. There are several guiding questions, as you can see them here, and first of all, they should make you reflect on the topic already by now, and as you know, they will then be answered by the end of today's micro lecture. So, the already addressed question of the relationship of EU law and ethics, virtue ethics, and the approach of Aristotle in that regard. Maybe you've already heard about the categorical imperative. So what's that? What is utilitarianism? What is the so-called wheel of ignorance as proposed by John Rawls? What is communitarianism, not communism, communitarianism? And the already mentioned three normative theories of deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. There are various concepts: law, values, ethics, morality, and religion. And as you can see, and that's also the subtitle of this book of Michael Sandel, what's the right thing to do? In the end, all those concepts try to answer what's the right thing to do. So how should we behave and how should we not behave? We've already seen in the micro lecture on morality more about the definition of morality. So as you can see here, so morality has a territorial component, a cultural one. It changes over the course of time, and it is based on certain values. Ethics, on the other hand, and this term has to be distinguished from the term of morality. As you can see, ethics, that's part of practical philosophy, where we have normative ethics, and as you can see, the three normative theories that I have already mentioned. So that's not something that changes over the course of time as morality, and which is different in different countries, but there are various philosophical approaches that would help us in order to find out what's the right thing to do. In the micro lecture on morality, we have also seen that very often morality in EU law is used as a kind of an umbrella, so to protect the member states from EU interference. So we could say not a very ambitious approach. Now, if we move on to today's topic, the relationship of EU law and ethics, it's quite often the case, and we can see that in an increasing way, as it's also mentioned in this open access book, that law as one discipline refers to another discipline, in our context, ethics, as we've seen, as a philosophical concept. And in this open access book, I've identified various categories of how that relationship of EU law and ethics looks like. So the first category, that's similar as morality, so a kind of an umbrella philosophy to simply protect member states from EU interference. There is a second category where ethics is used as an argument, so to say, to argue why a certain legal solution is a good solution, because it is claimed that that's an ethical requirement. Sometimes we find a parallel approach that if you ask, for instance, for a certain authorization, you don't only have to comply with certain legal requirements, but in addition you also have to comply with certain ethical requirements. So sometimes we find that, for instance, in research funding. Of course, especially if you apply for some funding, not only, but if you have to fulfill certain requirements which refer to ethics, at latest at this stage, you might be curious to find out what does it mean, ethical behavior. So this comes back to the question how to determine ethics in general or in a certain context. And as you can see here, we have various ways of doing that. There can be ethics committees at EU or at national level that would determine in a certain field what is considered to be ethical or unethical. There can be codes of conduct, again at EU or at national level, and sometimes we find references of EU law to other legal or other international documents. Sometimes, that's only rarely the case, it's in those documents itself that we can find further clarification. But last category, but I think a very important one, very often there is simply a gap and we have no clarification at all what this reference to ethics means. So it's like a reference into the unknown, so to say, because we have no idea what that should really mean. So again, at latest at this stage, but not only for this last category, you might become curious. So what does it mean, ethics? How is it defined? And as mentioned on this slide, that's a philosophical concept. So that's why we will look at different philosophers, as you can see them, an excerpt of some famous philosophers and their arguments or their approaches in order to determine what's the right thing to do. So let's first start with Aristotle, very famous ancient philosopher, which in one of his most famous books has argued that people strive to live in a political community. And obviously, if people don't live separately but in a community, we need certain rules in order to provide for a harmonious living together. And so he argued that society needs some kind of rules by law, so which can determine the good life. And one key element was this idea of virtue ethics. So to find a golden mean. So if you have different opposing virtues, the one extreme and the other, the idea is to find a golden mean, a middle ground, so to say. That's what he argued. Virtues, and that has to be emphasized, is something not just an attitude, but something that you also have to exercise. So if I may quote, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. So that's one of these ideas, not only this golden mean, but also virtues and inner disposition that you also need to exercise. Another very famous philosopher, French philosopher, Montesquieu, he came up with this idea of the separation of powers. So to control power and the exercise of power in a state. So the three functions or branches of power, the judiciary, the legislative power and the executive power. That's an idea which he has drafted in this book called The Spirit of Laws. Immanuel Kant was a philosopher which tried to come up with a, let's say, universal approach that should tell us how we should behave. So in order to determine what's the right thing to do, he referred to certain maxims which can be tested if they correspond to the so-called categorical imperative. Now, what's a categorical imperative? As you can see, it's not conditional. So if you want to achieve this objective, that's what you should do. So if you want to live very healthy, do some sports. So that's not a categorical imperative, because a categorical imperative tells you what to do irrespective of the outcomes. So as it's also mentioned here, it's referring to the maxim what you should do irrespective of the outcomes. And this categorical imperative, as it's mentioned here on the bottom of the slide, there's certain criteria which we need to keep in mind. So first of all, whatever we want to do would we want it to become a universal law? There's a very famous example. Imagine a friend is hiding in your home because he's afraid of a murderer, and the murderer then knocks on your door. Should you be able to lie to the murderer, telling him, no, your friend has not hidden in your house, which would be a lie, but you would do it for the consequence, so that you save the life of your friend? According to this point of view, that would not be possible, because you would not want lying to become a universal law. Another very important element is the question of how to treat human beings, and that's the question of means and ends. So you should not treat human beings in a way that they are treated as objects, like things, but you should always treat human beings as subjects. That's another second very important element of this categorical imperative. And as you can see, autonomy acts so that you treat the will of every rational being as a will that makes universal law, is another very important element of this categorical imperative. So here on this slide, from a book where his works have been translated, there you have those more comprehensive elements of this categorical imperative. Michael Sandel, a philosopher which we'll see in the following, he has emphasized some key elements of the works of Immanuel Kant. And I may quote, one very important element is basing morality on interests and preferences, that this destroys its dignity. And Immanuel Kant is very often quoted when talking about human dignity, which is one of the core values of the European Union. So human dignity, and that's the link to what I've just said, means that you should treat human beings as subjects, not as mere objects. And that means that every human being has an intrinsic value. So if you look at this picture, which you might know, this man who had a valid ticket for a flight in the United States, and as the flight was overbooked, he was torn out of the aircraft in a very violent way. So that could be one example where you could argue that the intrinsic value of this human being has been violated if you drag him out of the aircraft in such a way. Talking about the categorical imperative, I very briefly also want to mention another imperative. And I think although I've mentioned that morality is more relative in terms of the changing of time than ethics, but of course philosophical answers would always deal with certain questions which are important for a society at a given moment. And so, although already written in 1979, I think also nowadays this ecological imperative of Hans Jonas is very important. If I may quote in the translated version, this imperative, so a general sentence, if you like, that tells us how to behave, states, act so that the effects of your action are compatible with the permanence of real human life on Earth. So, if we talk about the categorical imperative, I think it's also worth mentioning this ecological imperative of Hans Jonas. Now, so far we have looked at the intrinsic value of human life and so on. If we now move on to a philosophy which focuses more on the consequences, Jeremy Bentham is considered to be one of the founders of utilitarianism, and very often it's summarized in a simplified way in the slogan, the greatest good for the greatest number. So the idea that if we look at the consequences, at the outcome of certain behavior, the outcome will tell us whether our behavior was right or wrong. So we have this very famous example of the trolley car. Consider the trolley car is hurtling down those tracks, and it would kill 5 people lying on those tracks. And if we cannot warn them, should we actively redirect the trolley car to a sidetrack where we would only kill one person, which again we assume we cannot warn. So can we make a mathematic calculation saying the life of 5 people is worth more than the life of one human being? So that's a philosophical approach, as you can see, which had a lot of impact on policymakers, on economists and so on. So that's more focused on the outcome. If we move on, there is a very famous book by John Rawls, which is called A Serie of Justice. And in this book, Rawls argues that, of course, in every society, we have to deal with questions of fairness, and that there has to be a consensus about fairness. But obviously, everyone in society, depending on its role, whether he or she is wealthier or is in a worse situation, of course, everyone would determine fairness from a different perspective. And so, or we could say everyone is biased in his view. So what he proposes is a very interesting thought experiment. So consider a wheel of ignorance, and you go through this wheel of ignorance, and you would actually forget about your current situation in today's society, your wealth, your status, your life, so to say. So if we go through this wheel of ignorance, if we don't know in which position we will have in society, what would we determine to be fair, not knowing about on which side of society we will end up. So I think that's it's a thought experiment, but I think a very interesting idea to get rid of all those biases. John Rawls has also defined 2 principles in this book on justice on page 53. So I quote first: each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties of others, so a kind of an egalitarian approach, and not talking about equal treatment, but talking about inequalities. So social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to everyone. One philosopher which very much dealt with those ideas of John Rawls is Michael Sandel. And in his book on justice that I've already mentioned, he argued that it should not be freedom of choice of every member of society. So that's can also be important, but that's not the main goal to lead us to a just society. It's also not neutral principles. So he also argued that utilitarianism, as we've seen it before, is not a way of leading us to a good society. He argued that we have to reason together about what we deem to be just or just distribution of scarce resources, for instance. And as you can see here, I think that's a very important statement. He also argued if you need to reason together, we also have to accept that other people have different point of view. So disagreement should in the end make our own position stronger and not weaker. And if I may quote at the bottom of the slide, justice is not only about the right way to distribute things, so distributive justice, it's also about the right way to value things. And as you can see on the next slide, some key ideas of his book, written or published in 2010, is this communitarian approach. Again, not to be confused with communist. So a society also has to work together and emphasize this element of being a community, meaning we have to think about this common good. He also argued in another book that there are some moral limits to markets, so that not everything should be for sale, that we also have to reason together about those elements, and that we need a public debate on those issues. One very interesting example that he also gave in this book is this phenomenon which he calls skyboxification. Imagine a sports stadium, and in previous times rich and poorer people would all sit on the same seats, eat the same sandwiches or have the same drinks. Nowadays, most likely they would be separated, so the richer ones being up in a skybox, so a VIP area if you like. And he argued that separating people so that they don't meet in public is very endangering for our society and for us working together. And as I already mentioned, he also argued that it's very important to have this public discourse, and again that disagreeing on a certain topic should in the end create a better solution, taking into account different views, and should not be seen as a disadvantage. So maybe you've already implicitly seen in this second part on those philosophers that they might follow different normative theories. And again, on this slide we have the three normative theories of deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. So now I would just want to put that together and also again explain it on a broader scale. So deontology, and Kant that we have seen earlier, would be one proponent of this normative theory. So here we focus on an act because we deem it to be intrinsically right or wrong, and we don't focus about the consequences. On the other hand, as the name already indicates, consequentialism, and Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill would be proponents of this second normative theory. They rather focus on the outcome, on the results. And again, utilitarianism is one of the most prominent examples of this second school of thought. So with the act, we have the outcome, and if we move on to virtue ethics, so here we rather focus on the acting person itself. So the virtues, those character traits which we deem to be morally admirable or valuable, and virtues as an inner disposition that we also need to exercise on a constant basis. So here you have the literature mentioned on these slides, and now you know about, first of all, the relationship of EU law and ethics, so those different categories that we have seen. We have seen about virtue ethics, especially with regard to Aristotle. So the golden mean between two extremes, for example, as is mentioned here, excess and defect, so having too much or too little. Of course, and I think that's very important to emphasize, if we say it's the golden mean between two extremes, it would never be, as it's mentioned here, precisely the middle. It would be somewhere in the middle, but if it would be a mathematical calculation, it would be very easy to say that's the one extreme, that's the other, and it's always precisely in the middle that we find the golden mean. So that's, as it's mentioned here, the golden mean for one person in one situation will differ from the mean for someone else in a different situation. I think that's very important to emphasize. We've also seen the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant, so trying to determine as such what would always be considered to be the one way to do it. We have also seen the ecological imperative of Hans Jonas. We have also seen utilitarianism, focusing on the outcome, so the slogan of the greatest good for the greatest number. And going on to John Rawls, we have seen this wheel of ignorance, I think a very interesting thought experiment, which should try to help us to get rid of all our biases that we have. And communitarianism as the this idea that we as a society have to reason together about how we want not only to distribute scarce resources, but in general what we consider to be the right thing to do. And as we've seen now in the third and last part of today's micro lecture, 3 normative theories within philosophy. We've also seen the different proponents, either rather focusing on the act, so deontology, on the outcome, consequentialism, or on the agent itself, so that would be virtue ethics. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.